He wasn't supposed to be remembered. Not after the uniform came off and the years caught up with his bones. Not after the doors closed and the lights dimmed and the world quietly moved on without him. The kennel smelled of antiseptic and rust, a cold, hollow scent that clung to the back of the throat, and beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, rows of retired K9s lay in silence, their bodies still, their eyes open, not with fear, but with something heavier, something learned over time. The quiet understanding that they had been useful once and were not anymore. Metal bars cast long shadows across the concrete floor, stretching like prison lines no one intended to erase. And somewhere in the distance a loose chain tapped softly against steel, a slow, hollow rhythm that filled the space between breaths. These dogs had once run through chaos without hesitation, had once followed commands through smoke, through noise, through uncertainty, their paws hitting the ground with purpose. Their hearts locked onto a single truth: protect, serve, stay. But now they lay in numbered enclosures, their names replaced by tags clipped to the front of their cages, ink fading, letters worn, identities reduced to records that would soon be filed away. One of them, a German shepherd with a dark sable coat dulled by time, lifted his head slightly as footsteps echoed down the corridor, not fast, not urgent, just steady, measured, unfamiliar, and his ears twitched at the sound, not fully rising, not fully trusting, just enough to acknowledge that something had changed in the air. His name had once been Rex, though no one had spoken it in weeks, maybe longer, and yet it lingered somewhere inside him, tied to memories of commands and praise, of a voice that used to carry warmth even in the harshest moments. The footsteps drew closer, boots against concrete, each step deliberate, each pause intentional, until a figure appeared at the far end of the row, silhouetted briefly by the overhead light before stepping fully into view. A man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, posture straight in a way that didn't fade with time, his face lined not by age alone, but by things he didn't say out loud, his eyes scanning slowly, not quickly, not clinically, but carefully, as if each cage held more than just a dog. The air shifted, subtle but real, and for a moment the silence felt different, less empty, though no one moved to greet him. No tails wagged, no barks broke the stillness, because these dogs had learned that hope, like commands, could disappear without warning. The man stopped midway down the corridor, his gaze settling on Rex, and for a long second neither of them moved. The distance between them filled with something unspoken, something that didn't need words to exist, and Rex held that gaze longer than he had held anything in weeks, not out of strength, but out of instinct, the kind that doesn't fade even when everything else does. Somewhere behind the man, a clipboard shifted, papers rustling, a voice beginning to speak about schedules, about costs, about procedures that sounded clean on paper but heavy in reality. Yet the man didn't respond right away, didn't look back, didn't break the moment, and instead took one slow step closer to the cage, then another, until he stood just outside the metal bars, close enough to see the faint tremor in Rex's breath, close enough to notice the way the dog didn't retreat, didn't advance, just waited. And in that quiet, under the hum of failing lights and the distant echo of a world that had already moved on, something almost invisible passed between them. Not a command, not a promise, just a pause long enough to matter, the kind that doesn't happen by accident, the kind that changes what comes next without anyone saying a word. The man did not reach for the latch right away, and that hesitation mattered more than any sudden movement ever could, because in a place like this, where every action had once meant a command, a signal, a decision that could not be questioned, the absence of action felt almost foreign, and Rex watched him with a stillness that came not from calm, but from calculation, the kind that had been trained into him over years of service, where waiting was sometimes the only way to survive. Behind the man, the voice with the clipboard continued, steady and detached, listing numbers instead of names, ages instead of stories, explaining how long each dog had been retired, how long they had remained unclaimed, how the costs added up in quiet increments that turned loyalty into liability, and the words hung in the air like something too clean for what they described, as if the reality had been filed down to fit inside neat sentences. The man finally spoke, his voice low, not raised, not demanding, just present in a way that shifted the weight of the room, and he asked a question that did not belong to procedure, not to policy, but to something older, something human. He said, "How long have they been here?" And the answer came quickly, almost rehearsed, some for months, some longer, a few over a year, and at that, the man's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough to be noticed by most, but enough that Rex caught it, because dogs like him were trained to notice what others missed. The man crouched thin, slow and deliberate, lowering himself to Rex's level without crossing the invisible line of the cage, and the movement was careful, respectful, as if he understood that trust did not return just because someone wanted it to. And for a moment there was only the hum of the lights and the distant sound of traffic outside, a reminder that life continued somewhere beyond these walls. Rex did not move forward, but he did not retreat either, and in that balance there was a fragile thread of possibility, thin as it was, and the man let out a breath he had been holding longer. Then he realized, his eyes scanning the faint scars along Rex's flank, the subtle stiffness in his posture, the way his ears flicked at every small sound, not out of fear but out of habit that had never been turned off. The clipboard voice shifted again, mentioning timelines, mentioning decisions that would need to be made soon, words like placement and outcome that tried to soften what they stood for, and the man finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the speaker, but his eyes did not leave Rex for long, as if something in that quiet exchange held more weight than everything else in the room. He stood then, slowly, the motion controlled, and took a step back, his gaze moving down the row of cages, one after another, each dog carrying the same stillness, the same waiting, the same unspoken question of whether anyone would come back for them. And with each step the man's shoulders seemed to carry more, not less, as if the weight of what he was seeing was settling into him piece by piece. He stopped at the end of the row, turned back once more, and looked at them all, not as units, not as cases, but as something else entirely, something that had been lost, somewhere between service and silence. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not break, but it carried a certainty that did not need volume. He said, "There is no one coming for them." Is there? And the answer, though quiet, filled the entire corridor. No, there is not. And for a moment nothing moved, not the dogs, not the man, not even the air, because sometimes the truth does not need to be loud to be heavy. Sometimes it just needs to be said out loud once, and the man nodded, slightly, as if confirming something he had already known before he walked in, something he had carried with him long before this moment. And when his eyes returned to Rex, there was a shift there, subtle but undeniable, not pity, not hesitation, but a decision forming in silence, the kind that does not announce itself until it is already too late to turn back. The decision did not arrive like a storm or a sudden revelation. It settled in quietly, the way dust gathers in forgotten corners, unnoticed until it is everywhere. And Officer Daniel Hayes stood there for a long moment after the answer had been given, his hands resting at his sides, his shoulders still, but something inside him had already shifted beyond return. The clipboard voice cleared its throat as if to move things forward, mentioning forms, mentioning protocols, explaining that adoption was possible but limited, that each case required approval, that not every dog would qualify. The words careful and measured, designed to keep expectations small and manageable. But Daniel did not respond immediately, because he was no longer listening to the system. He was listening to something older, something quieter, something that had followed him long before this hallway, long before these cages, something that sounded like memory. It came in fragments, not images exactly, but sensations, the weight of a pack against his shoulders, the dry heat of a distant landscape, the sound of boots pressing into sand, and beside him, always beside him, the steady presence of a dog that never questioned, never hesitated, even when the path ahead was uncertain. And there had been a moment, one he did not speak about, when he had been the one left behind, when the noise had faded and the world had narrowed to breath and distance, and the slow realization that not everyone makes it back the same. And in that moment, it had not been a command that kept him going. It had been the quiet refusal to give up on something that still trusted him. Daniel exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest as if it had been held there for years, and he turned fully toward the clipboard holder now, his expression calm, Not confrontational, not emotional, just certain, and he asked how many. Not how many could be saved, not how many were available, but simply how many. And the question seemed to catch the other man off guard for a second, because it did not fit the usual pattern. It did not align with limits or budgets or expectations. It asked for the whole truth without narrowing it down. The answer came hesitantly, a number spoken softer than before, a number that felt heavier than it sounded, and Daniel nodded once, as if confirming something that had already taken shape inside him. And then he said it, not loudly, not dramatically, just plainly, the way you say something that is already decided. He said, "I will take all of them." And the words did not echo, they did not need to, because the silence that followed carried them further than sound ever could. The clipboard shifted again, a slight laugh, uncertain, not mocking but disbelieving, followed by a reminder of reality, of cost, of space, of responsibility. All the reasons that statement did not make sense, all the reasons it should be reconsidered, but Daniel did not move, did not argue, did not raise his voice, because he was not negotiating, he was stating something that had already been chosen. Down the row, something subtle changed, not movement exactly, not yet, but a shift in attention, as if the air itself had leaned slightly toward him, and Rex lifted his head a little higher this time, his ears adjusting, catching the tone rather than the words, because tone was what mattered, tone was what carried truth, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, no flicker of uncertainty that would signal retreat. Daniel took a step back toward the cage again, slower this time, and he lowered himself once more, not out of necessity but out of intention, bringing himself into that same quiet space he had shared with Rex before, and for a second, just a second, he extended his hand toward the bars, not reaching through, not forcing contact, just placing it there where it could be seen, where it could exist without demand, and Rex watched it, his gaze steady, his body still, but something in his posture softened by a fraction, so small it could have been missed by anyone not looking for it. And Daniel spoke again, not to the clipboard, not to the room, but to the dog in front of him, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if it was meant for one listener only. He said, "You are not done yet." And the words carried no command, no expectation, just a simple offering, the kind that could be refused, the kind that meant more because it was not forced. Behind him, the practical world continued, voices discussing feasibility, timelines, logistics, but those sounds felt distant now, like something happening on the other side of a wall, because in that narrow space between a man and a dog who had both been left behind in different ways, something else had begun, something that did not need permission, something that would not wait for approval, something quiet and fragile and stubborn enough to change the direction of everything that came next. The room did not return to what it had been before those words were spoken, because once a decision like that enters the air, it does not simply disappear. It lingers, it presses against the walls, it settles into the silence until even the smallest movement feels different, and the man with the clipboard shifted his weight again, flipping through pages that suddenly seemed less certain than they had a few minutes ago, his voice lowering as he spoke about requirements, about home inspections, about the reality of caring for animals that had known only structure and duty for most of their lives, and each point was valid, each concern grounded. But none of them reached Daniel in the same way anymore, because he was no longer measuring the situation against convenience. He was measuring it against something far less negotiable. He listened without interrupting, his expression steady, his posture unchanged, and when the list of obstacles finished, he simply nodded once, not in agreement, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement, as if to say he understood every word and had already chosen to move forward anyway. And that quiet acceptance unsettled the rhythm of the room more than any argument would have. Rex remained where he was, but the angle of his head shifted slightly, his eyes tracking Daniel not with suspicion now, but with a kind of focused attention that had not been there before, the kind that came from recognizing a pattern, a tone, a presence that did not match the ones that had come and gone before. And there was a faint movement in his chest, a deeper breath drawn in and released slowly, as if something inside him had adjusted by a fraction. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object, not something meant to impress, not something new, but something that had been carried long enough to lose its shine. a simple metal tag attached to a short chain, and he held it in his palm for a second before letting it rest against his fingers, the metal catching the light briefly. And though he did not explain it, did not offer context, it was clear that it belonged to a different time, a different chapter that had not fully closed. He did not show it to the others. He did not hold it up. He simply kept it there as if grounding himself in something that did not change, and then he closed his hand around it again, a quiet motion that spoke more than any explanation could have. The clipboard voice returned, softer now, suggesting a meeting with administration, suggesting that such a decision could not be made in a single moment, that there were processes to follow, steps to complete, and Daniel nodded again, this time with a slight shift of his shoulders, as if preparing to step into whatever came next, and he stood up fully, the movement controlled, deliberate, before taking a slow step backward from the cage. He did not turn away immediately. He gave the space one last look, his eyes moving from Rex to the others, one by one, not counting them, not assessing them, but seeing them. And there was a difference in that, a difference that did not go unnoticed even in a place that had grown used to being overlooked. Somewhere down the row, a faint sound broke through, not a bark, not a whine, just a small shift of paws against concrete, a quiet adjustment that carried more meaning than volume, and Rex's ears flicked toward it before returning to Daniel. His gaze holding steady for a second longer than before, Daniel took another step back, then another, until the distance between him and the cage returned. But something had changed in that space, something invisible but real, and when he finally turned toward the exit, his pace was not hurried, not hesitant, just firm, as if each step had already been decided before it was taken. The door at the end of the corridor opened with a soft mechanical sound, letting in a thin slice of outside air, carrying with it a faint scent of grass and distance, something that did not belong to this place. And for a moment it drifted through the room, subtle but unmistakable, brushing past the rows of cages before fading again, and Rex lifted his head just slightly toward that direction, not fully, not with expectation, but enough to notice that it existed, that there was something beyond the walls that still moved, still breathed, still waited. Daniel paused at the threshold for a fraction of a second, his hand resting on the door, his shoulders squared, and though he did not look back this time, the weight of what he had seen remained with him, settled into him in a way that would not loosen, and when the door closed behind him, the sound was soft, almost gentle, but it did not carry the same finality it once would have, because for the first time in a long while, the silence that followed did not feel like an ending. It felt like something waiting to begin. The air outside felt different the moment Daniel stepped through the door, not warmer, not brighter, but wider, as if the world had more space than the narrow corridor he had just left behind. And yet that space did not bring relief. It brought weight, the kind that settles in the chest when a choice stops being an idea and becomes something that will ask everything from you. The administrative office sat across the lot, a low building with clean windows and a flag moving slowly in the afternoon breeze, and Daniel walked toward it without hesitation, his pace steady, boots striking pavement in a rhythm that matched something older than this place, something ingrained from years of walking into rooms where decisions were not suggestions. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of paper and coffee, a contrast to the sterile sharpness of the kennel, and behind a wide desk sat a woman in her early 50s, posture straight, expression composed in the way of someone who had seen too many cases pass through her hands to be surprised easily. Her nameplate read Margaret Collins, and when she looked up, her eyes assessed quickly, not unkindly, but with the efficiency of someone who understood what requests usually sounded like before they were even spoken. Daniel did not sit at first. He remained standing for a second longer than necessary, as if aligning himself with what he was about to say. And when he did speak, his voice carried the same quiet certainty it had in the corridor. He explained what he wanted without embellishment, without appeal, just the facts of it, that he intended to take responsibility for every retired K-9 currently housed in the facility. And for a moment Margaret did not respond, not because she had not heard him, but because she was measuring the space between what was being asked and what was possible. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands, her gaze steady, and when she spoke, her tone was calm but firm, outlining the reality. With precision, she spoke of medical costs that could rise into thousands of dollars per dog, of behavioral rehabilitation that could take months or longer, of space requirements, licensing, inspections, insurance, and the kind of time commitment that did not allow for shortcuts. And none of it was exaggerated. None of it was meant to discourage. It was simply the truth laid out in full. Daniel listened to every word, his eyes not drifting, his posture unchanged, and when she finished, the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was deliberate, and he reached into his pocket again, not for the metal tag this time, but for something else, a folded document, worn at the edges, and he placed it gently on the desk, sliding it forward just enough for her to see. It was a property record, land he owned just outside the city limits, several acres of open space bordered by trees, modest structures already in place. Nothing extravagant, but enough to begin. Margaret's eyes moved over the paper, her expression shifting slightly, not softened, but recalibrated, and she asked a different kind of question then, not about feasibility, but about reason. Why all of them? Why not just one or two? Why take on something that would stretch any single person beyond what was reasonable? Daniel did not answer immediately, because the answer was not simple. It did not fit into a single sentence, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not weaker, but more personal. He said because no one came for them. And that was all. No explanation of past service, no mention of what these dogs had done, just that simple truth. And it settled between them in a way that did not need elaboration. Margaret held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back down at the document, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk, a small, thoughtful motion, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed just enough to signal that the conversation had moved from dismissal to consideration. She said it would not be immediate. There would be evaluations, inspections, paperwork, time, but it could be started. And Daniel nodded once, the same steady acknowledgement as before, not relief, not victory, just the acceptance of the next step. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic and something softer beneath it, something that did not belong to roads or buildings. And back in the kennel, where the light still flickered and the silence still held its weight, Rex remained where he was, but his head was no longer as low as it had been. His ears angled differently, not fully raised, not fully at ease, but no longer turned inward, and though nothing had changed. Yet in the physical sense, though the bars were still there and the floor was still cold, something unseen had begun to move, something that did not announce itself with noise or motion, something that started quietly, the way all real changes do, long before anyone else can see it. The days that followed did not move quickly. They stretched, slow and deliberate, as if testing whether the decision would hold under the weight of time. And Daniel returned each morning before the sun had fully risen, the sky still pale with that quiet blue that comes just before the world wakes, his truck pulling into the gravel lot with the same steady rhythm, tires crunching softly as he stepped out into the cool air, the scent of damp earth and distant pine lingering just enough to remind him that not everything was confined to walls and metal. Inside, the kennel greeted him with the same sterile light, the same low hum, but it did not feel entirely the same anymore, not because anything had physically changed, but because presence has a way of altering space, and his had begun to settle there, not loudly, not forcefully, but consistently, like something that refused to leave. He did not rush. He did not move from cage to cage with urgency. Instead, he walked the length of the corridor at a measured pace, pausing briefly at each enclosure, not always speaking, not always engaging, but allowing himself to be seen, to be recognized. And in that repetition, there was something unfamiliar to the dogs, something that did not align with the pattern they had come to expect, because people usually came once, maybe twice, and then disappeared, but he did not. Rex noticed first, not in a dramatic way, not with sudden movement, but in the subtle adjustments that only a trained animal would make. The way his ears began to orient toward the sound of Daniel's steps before they reached his cage. The way his posture shifted just slightly when the man entered the corridor, not rising, not approaching, but no longer entirely withdrawn. Daniel never forced the interaction. He never reached through the bars without invitation. Instead, he would crouch a few feet away, resting his forearms on his knees. His hands relaxed, his gaze steady but not intrusive. And sometimes he would speak, not commands, not directives, just simple words carried in a tone that did not demand response. He would say things like "good morning," or "you are still here," and though the words themselves held no special meaning, the consistency did, because consistency was something these dogs had once known and then lost. The staff began to notice as well. Small comments exchanged in passing, quiet observations about how the dogs seemed less rigid, less shut down, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to be seen if someone was paying attention. And Margaret Collins watched from a distance more than once, her arms crossed lightly as she observed Daniel's routine. The way he did not try to fix everything at once, the way he allowed time to do part of the work, and there was a shift in her expression too, not fully softened, but no longer guarded in the same way. Paperwork moved forward in its own steady pace. Inspections scheduled, evaluations noted, but inside the kennel something else was happening that no form could capture, something quieter, something slower, the rebuilding of a pattern that had once been broken. One morning, as the light filtered in at a slightly different angle, softer, warmer, Daniel crouched again near Rex's enclosure. The same distance, the same posture, and he placed his hand gently against the concrete floor just outside the bars, not reaching in, not closing the gap, just letting it rest there, still and open. And for a long moment nothing happened, the silence stretching in that familiar way, filled only by the hum of the lights and the faint sound of breathing. Then, almost imperceptibly, Rex shifted his weight forward, not fully, not with confidence, but enough that the distance between him and the bars lessened by a few inches, his head lowering slightly, his eyes fixed not on the hand but on the man behind it, searching, measuring, remembering. And Daniel did not move, did not react. He simply remained there, steady, present, allowing the moment to exist without pushing it further. Time passed in that stillness, seconds that felt longer than they were. And then Rex took one more small step, his paw sliding forward with a soft scrape against the floor, bringing him closer to the edge of the cage, close enough now that the space between them no longer felt like a barrier, but like a threshold. And he paused there, his breath steady, his body held in that careful balance between retreat and approach. And Daniel's voice came again, quiet, almost a whisper, "You can take your time." And the words did not carry expectation, they carried permission, the kind that had not been offered in a long while. Rex's ears flicked once, then settled, and though he did not yet close the final distance, though he did not yet reach the hand waiting just beyond the bars, something had already shifted in that space, something that could not be undone, because trust does not arrive all at once. It begins in moments like this, small, fragile, almost invisible, and yet strong enough to change everything that follows. It happened on a morning that did not look different from the others. The same pale light slipping through the high windows, the same quiet hum resting beneath everything. But something in the air felt steadier, as if the waiting itself had begun to change shape, and Daniel was already there, crouched in the same place, his hand resting where it had rested before, patient, unmoving, not asking for anything that was not freely given. Rex stood closer now than he had the day before, not by much, just a few inches, but enough that the space between them no longer felt empty, and his breathing had changed, slower, more measured, less guarded in a way that could only be noticed if someone had been watching from the beginning. Daniel did not speak at first. He simply stayed, letting the moment stretch without pressure, because some silences carry more meaning than words ever could. And in that stillness, Rex lowered his head just slightly, his nose moving forward, cautious, deliberate, until it hovered just short of the bars, testing the air, reading what could not be seen. The distance remained, thin as it was, and for a second it seemed as though he might pull back again, retreat into that familiar space of distance and control, but he did not. He stayed there, suspended between what had been and what might be, and Daniel's voice came softly, barely above a breath. "You are safe here," and the words did not echo. They settled, quiet and steady, like something meant to be believed slowly. A faint sound came from further down the corridor, another dog shifting, a low exhale, the kind that once would have meant nothing, but now it carried weight, because attention had begun to spread, not in movement, not in noise, but in awareness. as if the others were watching without looking, sensing without stepping forward. Rex took one more step, small, almost hesitant, and this time his nose reached the edge of the bars, the metal no longer a boundary but a line that could be approached, and for the briefest moment, his breath touched Daniel's hand. Not contact, not yet, but close enough that the space between them felt charged with something fragile and new. Daniel did not react, did not move closer, did not close the gap. He held his position exactly as it was, understanding that this was not a moment to take, but one to receive, and seconds passed like that, stretched thin and quiet, until finally, slowly, Rex extended his head just enough that his nose brushed lightly against the man's fingers. It was not a strong gesture, not a confident one, just a brief, tentative contact, a question more than a statement. And Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his hand remaining still, allowing the touch to exist without change. Rex withdrew almost immediately, stepping back half a pace, his ears shifting, his body returning to that cautious balance. But something had already crossed over. Something that could not be undone, because the first contact is never about touch alone. It is about permission, and that permission had been given, however briefly. Daniel's eyes softened, not with triumph, not with relief, but with recognition, as if he understood exactly what had just been offered, and he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, before slowly rising to his feet, not breaking the moment, not ending it, just letting it settle into something real, down the row. Another dog adjusted its position, then another, subtle movements that would have gone unnoticed days ago, but now felt connected, as if a single thread had begun to weave its way through the space, linking what had once been isolated into something shared. The staff member who passed by paused for a second longer than usual, glancing toward Rex's enclosure, noticing the shift without fully understanding it, and then continued on. Because some changes are too quiet to be explained in the moment. Daniel stepped back, giving the space room again, his gaze lingering on Rex for just a second before moving on to the next enclosure, the next pair of eyes, the next quiet presence waiting without expectation, and his routine continued. The same steady rhythm, the same deliberate pace, but now there was something different beneath it, something that had begun to grow not in words or actions, but in moments like this, small, fragile, and undeniable, and as the light in the kennel shifted, slightly, warming just enough to soften the edges of the cold concrete, Rex lowered himself back down, not in the same way he had before, not withdrawn, not distant, but with his head resting a little higher, his ears angled forward just a fraction more, as if somewhere deep within him, a memory had stirred, not fully awake, not fully formed, but alive enough to remain. The change did not arrive all at once. It never does. It unfolded in pieces so small they could be mistaken for coincidence. But over time those pieces began to form something steady, something real, and Daniel felt it the moment he stepped into the kennel that morning, not in what he saw, but in what he did not feel anymore, that heavy resistance in the air, that invisible wall that had once pushed everything back into silence. It was still quiet, still controlled, but it was no longer empty, and as he walked the corridor, his boots striking the floor with that same measured rhythm, there were subtle signs that the space had begun to breathe again, a shift of weight here, a slight turn of the head there, movements so small they would have gone unnoticed before, but now they carried meaning. Rex was already standing when Daniel reached his enclosure, not rigid, not fully relaxed, but present, his ears angled forward just enough to signal attention, and his eyes followed the man with a steadiness that no longer carried the same guarded edge, and Daniel slowed his steps as he approached, not wanting to break the fragile balance that had been built over days of patience. He crouched again, the same position, the same distance, his hand resting where it had rested before, open, still, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching in that familiar way. But this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt like something waiting to be completed. Rex stepped forward first, not as cautiously as before, not as hesitant, and when he reached the bars, he did not stop short. He did not pull back. He lowered his head and pressed his nose gently against Daniel's fingers, holding the contact this time, not fleeting, not questioning, but present, and Daniel's breath slowed in response, his hand remaining steady, allowing the moment to exist without shifting it into something else. There was a warmth in that contact, simple and quiet, but undeniable, and it moved through the space between them in a way that did not need explanation, because trust, once it begins to take shape, does not announce itself, it simply stays. Further down the row, another dog stood, then another, not approaching, not yet, but no longer turned away, their attention drawn not by sound, but by something less visible, something carried in tone and presence and repetition, and Daniel felt it as he stood, his gaze moving from Rex to the others, seeing the same small changes beginning to take hold. Later that afternoon, the paperwork reached its next stage, approvals moving forward with conditions attached, timelines outlined, inspections scheduled, and Margaret Collins handed Daniel a stack of documents thicker than before, her expression steady but no longer distant. And she said it would take work, more than most people expect, and Daniel nodded, not because he needed to be told, but because he already knew. The property outside the city had begun its own quiet transformation, fences inspected, old structures cleared, space measured not just in acres but in possibility. And though it was not perfect, not yet, it held something the kennel did not. It held room to move, to breathe, to exist without confinement. That evening, as the light faded into a softer tone, Daniel returned once more to the corridor, standing at the center of it, looking down the line of cages that had once felt endless, and for the first time, he did not see rows of waiting. He saw something else beginning to form, something that had not been there before. And when he stopped in front of Rex again, the dog did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his head lifting slightly, his posture no longer balanced between retreat and approach, but grounded in something steadier. Daniel reached his hand a little closer this time, not through the bars yet, not crossing that final boundary, but closer than before, and Rex met it halfway, his nose pressing into the space between metal and skin, and he stayed there, not pulling away, not questioning, just present. And in that quiet contact, something settled fully into place, something that had been building since the first moment their eyes met. Something that did not need to be named to be understood. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the scent of open space and distance. And though the walls of the kennel still stood, though the doors were still closed, there was a shift that could not be reversed. Because for the first time in a long while, these dogs were no longer waiting for someone who would not come. They were beginning to recognize someone who already had. The morning they opened the doors did not come with ceremony. There were no announcements, no gathering of people to witness it. Just a quiet shift in routine as the final approvals settled into place, and the paperwork that had once felt heavy became something simple, something that allowed movement. And Daniel stood at the entrance of the kennel earlier than usual, the light outside still soft and gray, his hand resting on the latch as if feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Inside, the dogs waited as they always had, but not in the same way. Not with that empty stillness that had once filled the space. There was a tension now, a quiet awareness that had grown over days into something steady, something that did not need to be explained. Margaret Collins stood a few steps behind him, her posture composed, her expression calm, but carrying a depth that had not been there before, and she did not speak. She simply gave a small nod, the kind that does not signal permission as much as acknowledgement, and Daniel returned it with one of his own before turning back to the door. The sound of the latch releasing was soft, almost unremarkable, but it carried through the corridor in a way that shifted everything. And when the first door opened, the space did not erupt into motion, it held, as if even freedom needed a moment to be understood. Daniel did not rush forward. He stepped inside slowly, his presence steady, his voice quiet as he spoke the same simple words he had repeated every day. "Good morning," and the familiarity of that tone settled over the room like something known, something safe. Rex was the first to move, not quickly, not with sudden energy, but with purpose, his body rising from the floor, his steps measured as he approached the open space where the barrier had once been, and he paused there, just at the edge, as if marking the moment, his head lifting slightly, his ears forward, and Daniel crouched again, the same way he always had, lowering himself to meet him without closing the distance too quickly. For a second, the world narrowed to that space between them. the quiet hum fading into the background, the light catching softly on Rex's coat, and then he stepped forward, crossing the threshold fully this time, not stopping at the line, not holding back, and he pressed his head gently against Daniel's chest, not with force, not with urgency, just with a quiet certainty that needed no explanation. Daniel's hand came up slowly, resting against the dog's neck, his fingers moving through the coarse fur in a motion that was steady and familiar, and he closed his eyes for just a moment, not in relief, not in triumph, but in something deeper, something that felt like the end of a long silence. Behind them, the other doors opened one by one, not all at once, but in a rhythm that matched the pace of the moment, and the dogs began to step forward, some cautiously, some more certain, each carrying their own history, their own hesitation, but none turning back, because the presence that had stayed had become something they could follow. Outside, the air carried the scent of open land, of grass and distance, and as they were guided gently toward the waiting transport, there was no rush, no urgency, just a steady movement forward, as if time itself had slowed to allow the moment to settle fully. Margaret remained by the doorway, watching as the last of them passed, her arms resting loosely at her sides, her expression thoughtful, and when Rex paused briefly, glancing back for a fraction of a second, it was not out of uncertainty, it was acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of where he had been before turning forward again. Daniel walked beside them, not leading, not pulling, just present, his steps matching theirs, and when they reached the edge of the lot where the open space began beyond the fences, he stopped for a moment, looking out over the land that would soon hold them, not as a solution, not as an answer, but as a beginning. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it a sense of something wider than anything they had known inside those walls, and Rex stood at his side, his posture steady, his gaze forward, not searching, not waiting, just there. And in that quiet, with no words spoken and no need for them, it became clear that what had been given was not just a place to go, but a reason to move again, a reason to trust what comes next, and though nothing about the past had changed, something about the future had, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to matter, enough to stay.